Sharks have been swimming in the oceans 4,000 times longer than humans have been walking on the land. They have thrived for more than 450 million years, while the Earth's continents and seas have transformed around them. Even the dinosaurs were modern by comparison, and they came and went in a fraction of the time sharks have existed. This is the shark story, from the monsters of prehistory to the sophisticated killers of today. The word shark usually brings to mind something like this. It's a blue shark. It has the classic shark body shape and the classic association with underwater clouds of red. This crimson tide isn't blood, though. It's a mass of tiny shrimp-like animals called krill. Blue sharks, like most sharks, live in tropical waters. But most is about all you can ever say when generalizing about sharks. They are a theme with hundreds of variations. They have evolved over millions of years, living in every ocean in the world, even as far from the tropics as this.
Ice. Ice is the word up here, and it doesn't matter whether you're a shark or whether you're a person fishing for a shark. You have to deal with the ice, so we've got to dig a hole through the ice, through 8 feet of sea ice. It takes a while. It could take a half a day to dig a hole big enough for a big shark.
George Benz is on the Arctic ice cap, trying to get through to a Greenland shark. Little is known about this animal. Among the few known facts are that it lives farther north than any other shark, that it's huge, up to 23 feet long, and that it's thought to live right at the bottom of the sea.
I'll check that out. Look at that. There's the hole.
Wow, it's bright.
A remote-controlled infrared television camera can take human vision into an otherwise impossible place.
What's the bottom? 490, 494?
490, 492, somewhere in there.
We're almost to the bottom.
Should be coming up very shortly. There it is.
Oh, rock. Urchins.
In total darkness, under extreme pressures, only a few deep-sea creatures like brittle stars can survive here. An improbable place, then, to find a gigantic predator. Two of the Greenland shark's particular mysteries are exactly what it eats and how it eats it. The how is a revelation. The shark hangs upside down and rotates, carving out plugs of flesh with its shearing lower teeth. Greenland sharks do leave these depths. They're known, for instance, to follow fishing boats, and they're even known to eat land mammals. A whole reindeer, minus the antlers, was once found in one's stomach. But the question remains how the shark caught it. Greenland sharks are scavengers of the deep, but can they also attack and kill at the surface? This is what George Benz wants to find out.
Ready? Yeah, 1, 2. Roll it.
The idea is to tag and then track the shark, discovering how much time it spends near the surface. At minus 20 degrees, they have to work fast, or the shark's gills will freeze.
Roll right over, she'll go right in.
Yep.
All right?
Ready? All right, let's go!
As far as anyone can tell, the shark is completely unaffected by the experience it's just had. The Greenland shark is an unusually sluggish creature, and its flesh is toxic, so it's rarely hunted. Stranger still, it is virtually blind. Attached to its eyes are parasites with 2 worm-like cases. No one knows what they're doing there. Now, tagged with an acoustic transmitter, this female can provide the first clues about what Greenland sharks do under the ice. Will she plunge straight back into deep water or remain close to the surface? The tag sends sound pulses to receivers embedded in the ice.
These last three were strong.
Yeah.
She's plateaued at 144 meters. But that's only the last few minutes, but she's not going any deeper, and we know it's deeper out there.
The female does not head straight down to the sea floor, but continues to swim around under the ice, literally beneath the scientist's feet. This proves that Greenland sharks do not spend all their time at the sea bottom, and they may well be active predators of the ice. If the predators of today are hard to imagine, try unlocking the secrets of the dead. Australia is the final resting place of some of the world's oldest sharks. Gavin Young has found fossils here that date back to the Devonian era, almost 500 million years ago. At that time, a massive inland sea covered half of Australia.
We can see here the sedimentary layers that were deposited over many thousands of years at the bottom of this deep lake. And each time I prise open one of these layers, I'm exposing the surface to the light for the first time in 400 million years. This is a very important specimen. Here we have the portion of the brain case, and we can see the little grooves that would have contained blood vessels or sensory canals crossing the head of the shark. And just beside it, patches of skin impressions.
To look at them, you would never guess how rare these fossils are. Sharks leave very few fossils behind when they die. That's because their boneless skeletons tend to decompose before the gradual process of fossilization can even begin. The most that's left behind, usually, are some fragments of scales and teeth, a pretty meager basis for reconstructing a whole shark, or for that matter, a whole history of sharks. But then there are a few places like this, where by a fluke of chemistry and climate, ancient sharks have been frozen in time.
The breakthrough came when I discovered these impressions of tiny teeth, just the same as the ones I'd found in similar rocks in Antarctica.
The teeth match those of Antarcticlamna, an ancient southern shark. But why were these fossils scattered across the globe, on continents thousands of miles apart? The answer lies in the Devonian era, when the world was a very different place. If you looked at a map of the Earth back then, you'd see that Australia and Antarctica were joined into a giant southern landmass. It was during this time that the first sharks appeared. The land was still virtually lifeless, but the sea was filled with action. The fossil remains of other ancient sharks have been chipped out of rocks all over the world. And while it is impossible to know for sure what these extinct creatures were like, their remains provide some clues. The first sharks were the most advanced creatures alive. There were some primitive fishes, but they were not fast enough to escape the swift new predators. Sharks had their own enemies, such as the monstrous armor-plated fish Dunkleosteus. It preyed on them, or tried to, but sharks soon learned to outswim them too. It was this adaptability that probably helped the sharks to take over the seas. Australia is not only a shark graveyard, it remains the world's stronghold for living sharks, particularly along the Great Barrier Reef. Hammerheads have a prehistoric appearance, but are a relatively new model, only about 20 million years old. With eyes at each end of their hammer, they see the world in double vision. Like all sharks, their design is constantly changing. new evidence suggests the hammer is shrinking as evolution continues to perfect the strange design even further. White-tip reef sharks have existed twice as long as hammerheads and conform to the more traditional shape. They use their eyesight to identify each other, since each of the white tips that give the sharks their name is slightly different. The reason they may need to recognize each other is that they sometimes hunt in packs. Sharks of this type have a reputation as mindless killing machines, but in fact, they have the largest brains of all the fish. They have outsmarted their bony cousins for millions of years. The white tips have evolved blunt heads and eel-like bodies that enable them to squeeze between the coral. When they find a sleeping fish, they can descale it in an instant. Though capable of killing alone, teamwork makes white tips even more efficient hunters. When fish try to hide in the rocky crevices, the sharks can surround the coral, blocking off all possible exits. As a last resort, the fish lodge themselves into the crevices with their spines, but the shark's needle-like teeth can tear them out. When the tide recedes, the white tips return to deeper waters. Sharks carve up the reef into three-dimensional hunting territories. The wobbegong is a bizarre-looking ambush predator of the shallows. Strange tassels on its head and its beautifully patterned skin blend in with the coral. Unlike the wobbegong, the gray reef shark does not disguise its approach. It rises from the depths to hunt, cornering unwary fish on the reef edge. And this is what people call a zebra shark. It's named for its juvenile pattern of stripes before they change to spots. Unlike a lot of sharks, it has the ability to pump water over its gills even when it's lying still. This means it doesn't have to spend its life swimming to avoid suffocation. Lying still, it can tune its ultra-sensitive snout to the slightest movements of its prey, soft-bodied worms and crabs that it sucks out of the sand. Since sharks and bony fish went their separate ways, they have been in constant competition with each other, unknowing rivals in the great evolutionary race. Sharks may be the top predators, but the bony fish have won the numbers game. There are more than 12,000 living species to just over 1,000 sharks and rays. But there was a time when 70% of the fish in the sea were sharks. They were as colorful and abundant as the reef fishes are today. This was their heyday, known as the Age of Sharks. Today, the only reminders of that glorious time are the teeth they have left behind. Using fossil evidence and a little educated imagination, scientists have painted a picture of what it might have been like to swim in the shark-infested seas of the Carboniferous. The most abundant sharks were the unicorns, which were only about 1.5 feet in length. The male had a single antler that was probably used like a peacock's tail to impress females. But attracting too much attention was dangerous with the likes of the big, bizarre Stegocanthus around. It terrorized the smaller sharks, but they had special means of escape. Iniopteryx could fly. Helicoprion, the whorl-toothed shark, may have looked something like this and used its sawmill teeth to prey on the hard-shelled creatures of the day, ammonites. During the age of sharks, all this was normal. This is how the world was. And then the world ended. It's known as the Permian mass extinction, the greatest disaster of all time. No one knows what caused it. The continents were colliding. There were massive eruptions, fluctuating temperatures, and the seas were shrinking. The effects of this extinction were devastating. Around 90% of marine creatures were wiped out. Such a mass extinction can be compared to a curtain at the end of an act. In time, it lifts to reveal something else happening. The age of bony fishes was here. In the race to repopulate the oceans, these fishes had a fundamental advantage over the sharks. They could reproduce quickly. Sharks have always had complicated sex lives. After the Permian mass extinction, this almost caused their downfall. It took the sharks more than 100 million years to recover from the Permian mass extinction. Because of their complicated sex lives, they struggle to keep up with the bony fish. And sex itself is still a bit of a struggle. In the shallow lagoons of the Bahamas, nurse sharks gather for an age-old ritual. Most fish simply release their fertilized eggs into the sea, but sharks have to go through this. They have to because their eggs are fertilized internally. Sex for sharks means getting dangerously close to one another. No one knows where nurse sharks drop their young, but these shallow lagoons are the breeding grounds for another shark, the lemon. More than half of all sharks give birth to live young. This female has been pregnant for almost a year. Inside her womb-like belly, up to 14 babies are waiting to break free. It is perhaps at this moment, more than any other, that it is possible for us to identify with sharks. This female is not just a fish, but an animal giving birth in the same way as we do. Surprisingly, sharks started doing this millions of years before the mammals had even appeared on Earth. One big difference, though. A shark mother has nothing further to do with her babies. As soon as they've broken free from the umbilicus, they are out in the world and on their own. Specifically, they're in among the mangrove roots, where baby-eating adult sharks can't reach them. The mangroves are a safe nursery for young lemons and other small fish. But the young sharks are nervous in a way they'll never be as adults. Otherwise, they're the terror of the mangroves. The dawning of a new chapter in shark history began in the changing seas of the Jurassic. It was one of those periods when the Earth seemed to be turning itself inside out. Intense volcanic activity shook the foundations of Pangaea, a massive continent that covered half the world at that time. But the forces weren't just destructive. They also created new opportunities. As this vast continent split, the splits themselves filled with water and became seas. Shallow seas, rich in sunlight and life. Over millions of years, the continents kept splitting and drifting farther away from each other. The seas became oceans that eventually resembled the oceans of today. As the world modernized, so too did the sharks. During the Jurassic, the ancestors of today's species were born. This was the dawning of a brave new world. On the land and in the air, a previously minor form of life was taking over. It was the age of the dinosaurs. And in the seas were a changing generation of sharks, some of them very like those that are still here today. The Port Jackson shark with its pig-like snout is a truly ancient creature. It's about as close to a Jurassic shark as you can get. Its ancestors first appeared in those prehistoric seas. The Port Jackson is a creature of age-old habits. Every August, under the first full moon, these sharks start to converge on their breeding grounds off the Australian coast, not far from Sydney. To get here, they have swum thousands of miles, and the females pile up together to recover. But the smaller males don't want to rest. They want to mate. Port Jacksons reproduce the old way, the way it is believed prehistoric sharks did. Instead of giving birth to live young, they lay eggs. Every 2 weeks, each adult female produces 2 spiral-shaped eggs. Sometimes a male will pick an egg up, probably to help to lodge it in the rocks. Each one is designed like a corkscrew, so it can be firmly wedged. If not, it is at the mercy of the elements. Hundreds wash up on the beaches, the casualties of reproductive roulette. They will play no part in the future of sharks. But thanks to good fortune or design, those eggs that held fast start to hatch 9 months later. Getting out of the egg case is a battle for the tiny shark, only about 8 inches long. Like any shark pup, its first instinct is to head for a place that's safe for youngsters and away from adults. For the young Port Jackson, these seagrass beds are nursery grounds where it can suck worms and crustaceans out of the sand. Though safe and plentiful, this nursery ground is in someone else's territory. Another bottom feeder, an eastern fiddler ray, declares that the pickings on this piece of ground are its own. This will be the pup's home for the next few years. One of the few sharks whose lifespan is known, these Port Jacksons will return here for the next 25 years. As for the ray, it and the shark have a lot in common. In fact, it is a kind of shark. and it's a form that also originated in the Jurassic. Over that vast period, one group of sharks began to concentrate on bottom feeding. In time, their mouths moved underneath their heads and their bodies flattened out. Their pectoral fins grew forward, taking in their heads, and turned into something like wings. This transformation has made them some of the ocean's most graceful swimmers. Now, there are more than 500 species of rays, and the manta ray, with its 20-foot span, is the most magnificent of all. Like slow-motion acrobats, they loop feed through the water as though it were air. The manta is probably about as far as you can get from the cliched image of the predatory shark. But it's an older model than the classic stars of the big screen. Those flesh-ripping Jaws types, though familiar to us, have existed for only a relatively short time. But it didn't take the newcomers long to dominate the oceans. This fledgling albatross is in a vulnerable position. As they leave their nesting beach and attempt to get airborne for the first time, they are under constant attack from tiger sharks. This one has a lucky escape. The tiger shark is one of the most adaptable of all the predatory sharks. It hunts in tropical waters from Hawaii to Australia. Every year, down in the blue water lagoons of the Great Barrier Reef, green turtles gather in the hundreds to find a partner and mate. It was in the Jurassic that these turtles' ancestors took to the sea. But in one sense, they never left the land. They still have to go ashore to lay their eggs. Theirs has been a story of scheduled mayhem. This tiger, a shark that eats anything from floating debris to people, has brain enough to know when the turtles will arrive, and it's waiting. As tired as she is after the rigors of mating, this turtle still has to go to the top of the beach. But in time, she'll be back, which is something else the tiger shark knows. Tigers are hunters of dark waters. Their eyesight is 10 times more sensitive than our own in dim light. It waits. She's an old turtle, and she does what she's been doing every year for maybe 60 years. After a few hours on dry land, it's time for another year in the water. This is her low point, the most exhausted she gets. Every year, weakened females die on the beaches. Perhaps they are the lucky ones. A tiger shark can literally smell distress. It picks up the odor trail over a quarter of a mile away and knows when an animal's ripe for the kill. At closer range, the turtle's movement creates waves of pressure that touch the tiger. It can feel at a distance. And then the electrical sense kicks in. Even the beating of the turtle's heart is enough to give her away. There's no chance of surviving this. But not all modern sharks are so bloodthirsty. About 60 million years ago, some adopted an entirely different approach. Every year, right on time, the remote waters off the Australian west coast are visited by giants.
Yeah, appears to be a whale shark about 200 to 300 metres, over.
Okay, whale shark, 10 o'clock, 150 metres.
This is the whale shark. Length, 60 feet. Weight, 20 tons. It's the largest fish in the sea. And it feeds only on the smallest things in the sea. Plankton, the countless tiny plants and animals, fish eggs and general living flotsam that drift on the currents. Throughout the year, a whale shark glides with the currents and skims off the cream of the plankton. Assorted bony fishes always swim with it, using its bulk for protection and its wake as an effort-saving slipstream. When a whale shark's mouth is wide open, a human could stand in it. Along with many others, this shark is feeding on a plankton bloom that appears every year off Ningaloo Reef. And when the bloom goes, so do the sharks. And no one knows where. They're the biggest fish in the world, and yet they just vanish. It's a measure of how enormous the sea is and how little people understand it. The technology of the space age is about to change all that. Shark biologist Brad Norman has been working with whale sharks for several years.
We'll be using this attachment device. We'll spear it into a whale shark. It's attached to a float that holds a satellite transmitter.
Armed with a dart gun, these scientists have come to satellite tag a whale shark for the first time. Until now, radio tags have only been able to track the sharks over small distances, and they go much, much farther than that. The transmitter sends signals thousands of miles into space. From now on, every time she surfaces, she will be pinpointed wherever she is. Six weeks later, and some questions are already being answered. The shark is now off the north coast of Australia, over 600 miles from where she was tagged. The bigger the fish, the smaller the sea, and whale sharks are believed to cover vast distances. Whale sharks, in evolutionary terms, are fairly recent. They appeared about 60 million years ago, when they and 3 other kinds of shark started feeding on plankton. And sharks weren't the only ones. Whales were trying it too. Massive animals, both fish and mammal, suddenly made radical changes in their diets. What was happening in the sea? It's believed there was a sudden global plankton bloom. Today, the humpback's only predators are humans, and possibly packs of killer whales. But then, life was different. Sharks were getting bigger, and the one that evolved to prey on the whales was the biggest and most terrible of all. This was the Tyrannosaurus rex of the sea, Megalodon. Megalodon, or big tooth, was the size of a whale shark and probably weighed more. It was anything but placid, and it would have eaten anything it could get its jaws around. There was nothing in the sea it wasn't big enough to kill. But how does anyone know Megalodon existed? The answer is its terrifying teeth. They've turned up in fossil beds all over the world, and the only explanation is a monster predator. The largest predatory shark today is the great white, and this is how its tooth compares to Megalodon's. Megalodon was probably still around at the time of the early humans, but it disappeared about 2 million years ago with the onset of the Great Ice Ages. About the worst thing that can happen to an animal is to have humanity for an enemy. For sharks, it's an evolutionary tragedy. On average, sharks attack 28 people every year, while we kill 100 million sharks. For these slow-breeding animals, our impact may prove to be more devastating than the Permian mass extinction. And we don't even know what we are destroying. The most endangered shark in the world is a mythical creature that is hardly ever seen. It's a strange-looking ray called the sawfish. Its home is the murky estuaries of Australia's northern territories. And it uses a weapon that looks like it went out of fashion in prehistory. In fact, there's an ancient feel to the whole mudflat. These periscope fish are pop-eyed mullets, and the reptile that stalks them is a survivor from the Jurassic. A fin is all that gives the sawfish's presence away. If a tooth of its vibrating saw hits a mullet, the mullet dies. The fish practically fly to avoid this prospect. Sawfish don't limit themselves to the estuaries. They also swim upriver. Not many saltwater fish can tolerate river water, but sawfish can excrete extra salt and survive in otherwise lethal waters. Sawfish may go upstream to look for fresh sources of prey, but here they face plenty of competition. This is crocodile country. Every stretch of the river belongs to someone. The saltwater crocodiles that live here are the largest in the world, and they don't like other predators crossing their territory. Not that that's much of a worry for a 10-foot shark with a barbed broadsword on its snout. There probably aren't any animals in this fish's world that would dare challenge it. If it's a male, its biggest danger is injury from other males. There are 20 lethal teeth on each side of the saw, reportedly used for jousting contests. Since Antarctic lamna first swam in its Devonian lake, some sharks have always entered fresh waters, but it has never proved to be a popular place for them to live. The sawfish, though, goes far upstream. This river leads into Arnhem Land, one of the most isolated places on Earth. Here, the sawfish's story goes on to dry land. For 50,000 years, the native Australians have been depicting both real and legendary animals on the rocks. In a ceremonial cave is the rainbow serpent, and this is the sawfish. The paintings here, old as many of them are, aren't just an ancient curiosity the way European cave paintings are. Work is still in progress. There are layer upon layer of images. River creatures, land creatures, legendary creatures, and people. These ancient images are enduring reminders of just how far sharks have come. It's extraordinary to think that hundreds of miles from the sea, people of the desert have come to regard this shark as an integral part of their lives. But most people don't feel that way. In their long history that spans almost 500 million years, sharks have lived through the greatest upheavals of all time, including the extinction of the dinosaurs. But it is only in the last 100 years or so that we have turned against them. And now, they may finally face extinction. If, with the help of science, our fear can turn to fascination, then that's the shark's best hope for the future. Then they will continue to evolve and change. It's anyone's guess what a shark born 1 million years from now will look like.